I never thought that disobeying a family tradition could trigger the worst nightmare of my life. It all began last Easter, when my extremely religious family followed all Catholic traditions to the letter as always. For as long as I can remember, my parents, grandparents, and uncles insisted on maintaining the abstinence from red meat throughout Holy Week, especially on Good Friday. It was something sacred to them, almost like a divine commandment that could never be broken. I grew up hearing that failing to uphold this tradition was practically an invitation to attract bad things. My grandmother would always say with that stern look, "Whoever eats meat on Good Friday is eating the flesh of Christ." That gave me chills when I was a child, but at 23 I thought I was old enough to decide what to believe, and frankly, I was tired of so many restrictions based on ancient superstitions. That Friday, my parents and siblings had gone to the Passion Mass that started at 6 in the evening. I made up an excuse about having a headache to avoid going with them. The truth is that I was never very connected to church matters, although I respected their faith. I stayed home alone, and as soon as the car left the garage, I felt a freedom that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I opened the refrigerator, and there was a package of ground beef that my mother had bought for Sunday, when the restrictions would end. I didn't think twice. I prepared an elaborate hamburger, with cheese, bacon, and everything I wanted. While frying the meat, I could smell the aroma filling the kitchen, and thought to myself how ridiculous it was to follow these traditions in the 21st century. I ate with pleasure, savoring each bite as if it were an act of silent rebellion against years of religious impositions. I finished eating, washed the dishes, and cleaned up any trace of my sin. I opened all the windows to disperse the cooking smell and even lit some incense to disguise it. No one would ever know. I sat on the living room couch to watch a movie while waiting for my family to return, which probably wouldn't happen until after 9 at night. It was getting dark outside, and as the sun set, I began to feel something strange in the atmosphere. I can't explain it well, but it was as if the air had become heavier, denser. Initially, I thought it was just guilt for having disobeyed a tradition so important to my family, but I soon realized it was something more. The silence of the house began to become oppressive, almost as if it were charged with a presence I couldn't see. That's when I heard the first noise, a scratching sound coming from the kitchen wall. At first, I thought it might be a rat or perhaps a cat that had entered through the window I left open. I got up to check, but found nothing. I closed the window and returned to the living room. A few minutes later, the sound returned, louder and closer, as if something were crawling through the hallway toward the room where I was. My heart raced. I took my phone to turn on the flashlight and went to check the hallway. Nothing, absolutely nothing. I started to feel stupid for being scared inside my own house. I returned to the couch, trying to focus on the movie, but it was impossible. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. That's when the lights began to flicker. First softly, almost imperceptibly, then more intensely, until they went out completely. I was left in darkness, illuminated only by the light of my phone. I checked the electrical box, but everything was normal. When I returned to the living room, I noticed a strong metallic smell that wasn't there before, a smell that reminded me of blood. I began to feel a strange pain in my stomach, as if something were churning inside me. I thought maybe it was just the hamburger that hadn't settled well, but the pain kept increasing, becoming more intense every minute. At the same time, I began to see shadows in the corners of the house, quick movements in my peripheral vision. That disappeared when I tried to look directly at them. Panic took hold of me. I ran toward the front door to get out of there, but when I reached it, the pain in my stomach intensified so much that I fell to my knees. That's when I saw it for the first time. A translucent figure standing in the corner of the living room watching me. I couldn't make out the details clearly, but it seemed to be the silhouette of a small person. I blinked several times, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the figure remained there, motionless, just observing me. The pain in my stomach worsened, and I began to break into a cold sweat. My phone rang. It was a message from my mother saying that Mass had ended, and they were on their way home. I never felt so much relief in my life. When my family arrived, they found me collapsed on the living room floor, pale and trembling. The pain in my stomach was unbearable. My father carried me to the car and we went straight to the hospital, On the way, I kept seeing that translucent figure now sitting in the back seat of the car beside me. No one else seemed to notice its presence. It didn't do anything, just watched me with what I felt was a look of satisfaction. At the hospital, the doctors diagnosed a severe food poisoning. "Did you eat something that went bad?" the doctor asked. I didn't have the courage to tell the truth in front of my family. I just nodded my head. I was hospitalized for 3 days with intravenous antibiotics. During that entire time, I continued to see that figure in the corners of the hospital room. Sometimes it looked like a child, other times just a dark shadow, but it was always there watching me. On the 3rd night of hospitalization, when I was alone in the room, the figure approached my bed. For the first time, I could see its face. Clearly, it was a child with a smile that chilled my soul. It didn't say anything, just stood there smiling as if it knew exactly what I had done, as if it knew that my suffering was a direct result of my disobedience. I closed my eyes tightly, praying for the first time in years, begging for it to. And when I was discharged from the hospital, I thought everything would finally end, that figure, that presence would be left behind along with the infection in my stomach. I was wrong. Upon returning home, I realized that the visions hadn't disappeared. On the contrary, they seemed to have intensified. Now it wasn't just one figure I saw, but several. Shadows that moved in the corners, silhouettes that quickly passed through the hallways, whispers that came from empty rooms. It was as if a veil had suddenly been lifted, and I could see things that had always been there but that no one else could perceive. My family noticed my change in behavior. I was quieter, scared, always looking toward the corners as if expecting to see something. My mother thought it was just the trauma of hospitalization, but my grandmother observed me with a different look, as if she knew exactly what was happening. One night, while everyone was asleep, she came to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. "You ate meat on Good Friday, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I couldn't lie to her. I just nodded, feeling tears spring to my eyes. She sighed deeply. "You opened a door," she said, "a door that shouldn't be opened." According to my grandmother, there was a much deeper reason for abstaining from meat during Holy Week than just religious tradition. It was a form of protection. She explained that during sacred moments like Good Friday, the veil between our world and the spiritual world becomes thinner. Breaking the fast on that day was like sending an invitation to entities that normally couldn't reach us. "What you're seeing," she said, "are spirits that have always been nearby, but that now can manifest themselves to you because you opened that door." I asked if there was any way to close that door, to make everything return to normal. She lowered her eyes. "It's not always possible to close a door once it has been opened. In the weeks that followed, I tried to live normally, despite the constant visions. I went to college, met with friends, did my daily tasks, all while pretending not to see the shadows that followed me, the faces that watched me through windows, the silhouettes that appeared in mirrors when I looked at myself. The worst part was the night. When the lights went out and silence took over the house, they became more active, more visible. I began to sleep with the light on, but that only projected sharper shadows on the walls. There was no escape. The figure of the child, the one I saw for the first time the night I ate the hamburger, remained the most persistent. While the other apparitions came and went, it was always present, always watching me. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and find it standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me with that smile that froze my soul. Other times, I would see it reflected in my phone screen, or in the bus window, or in the university bathroom mirror. It was as if it had become my shadow, following me wherever I went. The most disturbing thing was that, when I was with other people, I could see the child interacting with them, touching their shoulders, whispering in their ears, and no one but me perceived it. I began to obsessively research similar experiences. I spent hours on the internet, reading accounts of people who claimed to have opened spiritual portals, who said they saw things that others didn't see. I found stories about ancient fasting, traditions in various cultures, all with the same purpose, to keep away entities that could harm us. The more I read, the more scared I became. Some accounts spoke of people who never managed to get rid of these visions, who ended up going crazy or completely isolating themselves. Others mentioned purification rituals, exorcisms, methods to close the opened portals. I tried some of these methods, prayers, herbal baths, protective amulets, but nothing seemed to work. My health began to deteriorate again. The stomach pain returned, along with other symptoms, chronic insomnia, intense headaches, episodes of sleep paralysis, where I felt presences watching me, touching me while I couldn't move. I returned to the hospital several times, but the doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong. One of them suggested I seek psychiatric help, that perhaps I was suffering from hallucinations caused by stress or some mental disorder. I did. Consult a psychiatrist who prescribed antipsychotics. The pills helped to dull the visions, to make them less vivid, but I knew they were still there, just waiting for the medication's effect to wear off. It was during one of these consultations that I met Dr. Mendez, an older psychiatrist who, unlike the other doctors, didn't immediately dismiss my experience as a delusion. He listened attentively as I described everything I was seeing and feeling. When I finished, he remained silent for a long time, studying me with a thoughtful look. "You know," he finally said, "modern medicine has its limitations. There are things we cannot explain with our current science." He told me that throughout his 40 years of practice he had treated several patients with accounts similar to mine. People who, after specific experiences, began to see and feel things that others didn't perceive. The line between what we call real and imaginary is much thinner than we'd like to admit, he said. When I was discharged from the hospital, I thought everything would finally end. That figure, that presence, would be left behind, along with the infection in my stomach. I was wrong. Upon returning home, I realized that the visions hadn't disappeared. On the contrary, they seemed to have intensified. Now it wasn't just one figure I saw, but several. Shadows that moved in the corners, silhouettes that quickly passed through the hallways, whispers that came from empty rooms. It was as if a veil had suddenly been lifted, and I could see things that had always been there, but that no one else could perceive. My family noticed my change in behavior. I was quieter, scared, always looking toward the corners as if expecting to see something. My mother thought it was just the trauma of hospitalization, but my grandmother observed me with a different look, as if she knew exactly what was happening. One night, while everyone was asleep, she came to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. "You ate meat on Good Friday, didn't you?" she asked quietly. I couldn't lie to her. I just nodded, feeling tears spring to my eyes. She sighed deeply and took my hands in hers. "My son, what you're seeing now are spirits that have always been around us, but that we normally cannot perceive," she explained with surprising calmness. "When we break certain sacred rituals, especially on days like Good Friday, our energy field becomes vulnerable, open. It's as if you've temporarily acquired a sensitivity that most people don't possess." I desperately asked if that meant I would spend the rest of my life seeing these things. She smiled gently and shook her head. "No, my son, this will naturally pass with time, but you need to help your energy field rebuild itself." According to my grandmother, what I needed to do was elevate my spiritual vibration. She explained that these spirits, these energies I was seeing, were attracted to low vibrations, fear, guilt, anger, resentment. The more I feared them, the stronger they became in my perception. "Faith is like a shield," she said. "It doesn't matter what you believe in, but you need to have faith in something greater than yourself. That elevates your energy and drives away negative presences." In the following weeks, I followed my grandmother's advice. I began to meditate daily, something I had never done before. She taught me simple prayers, not necessarily religious ones, but positive affirmations that I should repeat whenever I felt afraid. She also encouraged me to spend more time outdoors, in contact with nature, and to practice acts of kindness, even small gestures like helping a stranger or being kind to someone who was having a difficult day. "Each good deed raises your vibration," she explained. "It's like lighting small lights inside you." At first it was difficult. The visions continued, and the figure of the child, the one I saw for the first time the night I ate the hamburger, seemed to always be nearby, watching with that disturbing smile. But gradually, as I followed the routine my grandmother had suggested, I began to notice a difference. The apparitions started to become less vivid, as if they were losing strength or moving away. The constant feeling of fear that accompanied me began to diminish. I still saw things occasionally, especially when I was alone or at night, but they no longer caused me the same terror. My grandmother explained that this was normal. "Your energy field is strengthening," she said. "It's like a muscle you're exercising. At first it's weak, but with time and consistent practice it becomes stronger." She assured me that eventually I would see the world as before, or almost. Some people who go through experiences like yours never go back to being exactly as they were before. Maybe you'll always have a certain sensitivity, a sharper perception than most, but you'll learn to control it, instead of being controlled by it. 3 months after the incident, the visions had become rare. I still occasionally felt a presence or saw a movement out of the corner of my eye, but nothing compared to the terror of those first weeks. The figure of the child, which previously tormented me constantly, now appeared only in occasional dreams, increasingly distant. My physical health also improved completely. The doctors were surprised by my recovery, considering the severity of the infection I had. "You have a strong immune system," one of them commented during my last follow-up appointment. I smiled, thinking that perhaps it wasn't just my immune system that had strengthened. A year has passed since that Good Friday. My life has returned to practically normal. I started going out with friends again, focusing on my studies, making plans for the future. The visions are now so rare that sometimes weeks go by without experiencing anything out of the ordinary. When it happens, usually in moments of stress or when I'm particularly tired, I know exactly what to do. I breathe deeply, repeat the affirmations my grandmother taught me, and remind myself that my energy field is strong enough to protect me. This year, when Holy Week came around again, I followed all the traditions without questioning. Not out of fear, but out of respect. I understood that some ancient traditions, however superstitious they may seem to modern minds, carry wisdom that our society has forgotten. I fasted not only from meat, but dedicated those days to reflection and gratitude. On Good Friday, while we were eating the traditional cod, I had the momentary impression of seeing that childlike figure one last time, not with its disturbing smile, but as if it were saying goodbye. It was just a glimpse so quick that it could have been just my imagination, but somehow I felt it was a cycle closing. Today I understand that what happened to me wasn't a punishment, as I initially feared, but an awakening, an opportunity to understand that there are more things between heaven and earth than our philosophy dreams of, as Shakespeare would say. I learned that our reality is much more complex and mysterious than we imagine, and that faith, not necessarily religious, but the belief in something greater than ourselves, has a power that science still cannot fully explain. That hamburger on Good Friday changed my life in ways I could never have foreseen, and although it was a terrifying experience, today I am grateful for it, because it taught me not only about the invisible world around us, but about the strength that exists within each of us, a strength capable of overcoming even our deepest fears. I grew up in the small town of San Cristobal de las Casas, in the state of Chiapas, Mexico, a place where time seems to run slower and traditions are passed down from generation to generation like precious treasures. For as long as I can remember, I learned that on Fridays we don't eat red meat. It wasn't just a religious matter, as many think. My grandmother always said that this tradition was much older than the church itself, that it came from the times when our Mayan ancestors lived in harmony with the earth and respected the cycles of nature. "Friday is the day when the earth rests, daughter," she would explain to me while preparing the traditional fish with achiote sauce. "On this day, we don't spill the blood of any animal. It's an ancient pact that our people made." For years, I followed this tradition without questioning, just like everyone else in the village. Even after moving to the big city to study nursing, I maintained the habit of eating only fish or vegetables on Fridays. It was almost automatic. Until I met Rodrigo, my current husband, a city man who made fun of village superstitions, as he called them. In the first years of marriage, I kept my traditions discreetly, without making a fuss, but over time I began to feel foolish for following something that I didn't fully understand myself. After all, I was a health professional, a modern, educated woman. Why was I still tied to these ancient beliefs? It was a Friday in March when I broke the tradition for the first time. Rodrigo had organized a dinner with his work colleagues at our house, and the menu was a full barbecue. When I commented about changing it to fish, he laughed and said I was being ridiculous. "Anna, you're a nurse. You work with science every day. Don't tell me you still believe in those village nonsense." I felt my face burn with shame. He was right, I was being irrational. That night I not only allowed the barbecue, but I also ate the meat, feeling a mixture of guilt and liberation. The meat was delicious, juicy, and nothing happened. Not a thunder, not a divine sign. Just a normal dinner with laughter and pleasant conversations. I went to bed thinking that I had finally freed myself from a silly superstition. It was that same night when the first dream occurred. I was walking through the forest that surrounded my native village, a place I knew well from my childhood. The sky was dark without stars, and I knew I was looking for something, although I didn't know what. The silence was oppressive. Not even the sound of insects or the wind in the leaves could be heard. Suddenly I heard a low sound like a moan of pain. I followed the sound to a small clearing where I found a deer fallen on the ground. The animal was alive, but severely wounded, with a deep cut in its neck from which blood flowed that looked black under the moonlight. Its eyes, large and wet, looked at me with an almost human expression of pain and accusation. I tried to approach to help, but the more I walked toward it, the more the blood spread, forming a circle around the animal. When I finally managed to touch it, the deer opened its mouth, and instead of an animal sound, I heard a clear human voice. "You have broken the pact." I woke up covered in sweat, with my heart beating so hard it seemed to want to leap out of my chest. Rodrigo slept peacefully beside me, oblivious to my terror. I tried to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, probably caused by the irrational guilt I felt for having broken the tradition. I got up, drank a glass of water, and went back to bed, determined to forget the dream. But I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. The image of the bleeding deer with those accusing eyes seemed etched on my eyelids, and that voice, so clear, so real. "You have broken the pact." What did that mean? What was this pact that my grandmother mentioned but never fully explained? In the following week, I began to feel the first physical symptoms. At first, they were just small discomforts, a persistent headache, a feeling of tiredness that didn't pass even after a night's sleep, a lack of appetite that made me force each bite. I attributed everything to the stress of work at the hospital, where the shifts were long and exhausting. But then the symptoms worsened. The headache transformed into debilitating migraines that left me bedridden, unable to bear any light or sound. The tiredness deepened into an exhaustion that made it difficult even to get out of bed in the morning. And I began to notice small, red spots appearing on my skin, first on my arms, then spreading to the rest of my body. As a nurse, I knew I needed to seek medical help. I had blood tests, CT scans, consulted specialists. All the results came back normal, or with such small alterations that they didn't justify my symptoms. "It must be stress," the doctors said one after another, "or maybe it's something psychosomatic. Do you have a history of anxiety?" I denied, frustrated at not being taken seriously. How could they say it was all in my head when I could barely function? The spots on my skin now itched and burned, and I had lost so much weight that my clothes seemed to belong to someone else. And every night, without fail, the same dream returned. The wounded deer in the forest, the spreading blood, that accusing voice. Sometimes the dream went further, and I saw other figures in the forest, shadows that moved among the trees. Watching, waiting. I always woke up at the same point, when I touched the animal and it spoke to me. Rodrigo was concerned, of course, but also skeptical. He encouraged me to see a psychiatrist, convinced that all my problems were mental. "You're sabotaging yourself, Anna," he would say. "It's as if you're punishing yourself for something." Maybe he was right. Maybe I was so conditioned by those ancient beliefs that my own body was rebelling against me. I decided to call my grandmother, something I hadn't done for weeks due to my condition. I needed to hear her voice, maybe even confess what I had done, although a part of me feared her reaction. When she answered, her voice sounded fragile and distant, older than I remembered. We talked about trivialities for a few minutes, until she suddenly asked, "You're sick, aren't you? I can feel it." My grandmother's question took me by surprise. How could she know? We were hundreds of miles apart, and I hadn't told anyone in my family about my condition. I hesitated for a moment, but then the words began to flow like water from a dam that finally breaks. I told her everything about the dinner, the meat I ate, the recurring dreams with the wounded deer, the inexplicable symptoms that no doctor could diagnose. As I spoke, I realized I was crying, tears silently running down my face. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, I thought the call had been cut off. "Grandmother?" I called with a trembling voice. "Hear me here," she finally responded with a calm but serious voice. "You broke more than just a simple tradition. You broke an oath that our family made many generations ago." Then she told me a story I had never heard before. More than 200 years ago, during a terrible drought that ravaged Chiapas, our ancestors were starving to death. The crops had failed, the rivers were drying up, and the cattle were dying in the parched fields. In desperation, my grandmother's great-great-grandfather, who was a respected Jilol in the community, made a journey to the top of the sacred mountain to ask for help from the spirits of the earth. There he had a vision. A red deer appeared before him and offered its own body as food for the village. But in exchange, it asked that the family make an oath, never again to spill animal blood on Fridays, the day when the earth renews its energies. "The deer is the messenger between our world and the world of spirits," my grandmother explained. "By offering its body, it made a blood pact with our family. The rain returned, the crops grew again, and our people survived. Since then, we respect that pact, abstaining from meat on Fridays as a way to honor the deer's sacrifice." I felt a chill run down my spine. Now I understood the meaning of the dream, of the words in tzotzil that the animal said to me, "You have forgotten the gift that was given to you." It wasn't just a superstition, as Rodrigo thought, but a sacred pact, a blood oath that had been passed down through generations. "What can I do, grandmother?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. "How can I fix this?" "You need to come home," she responded without hesitation. "Return to San Cristobal. The deer is calling you in your dreams. It's giving you a chance to renew the pact." I hung up the phone with a mixture of fear and determination. I knew what I needed to do. When Rodrigo came home that night, I told him about my decision to return to Chiapas. As expected, he opposed, arguing that I was allowing superstitions to control my life, that I needed psychiatric help, not indigenous rituals. We had our first big fight. In the end, he said that if I left, it would be without him. "Choose, Anna, either this madness or our marriage." The decision was painful, but inevitable. The next morning, with the spots on my skin redder and more painful than ever, I packed my bags and bought a ticket to Tuxtla Gutierrez, from where I would take a bus to San Cristobal. Rodrigo wasn't home when I left. He had gone to work earlier, avoiding saying goodbye. I left a letter explaining that I loved him, but that I needed to do this, that it was a matter of life and death. I hoped that when I returned healed, he would understand. The journey to San Cristobal was exhausting. The headaches were so intense that each jolt of the bus on the winding mountain roads was like a stab in my skull. When I finally arrived, it was already night. The city was different from how I remembered, yet more touristy, with more lights and noise. But still, I felt an immediate connection, as if the earth itself was recognizing me, calling me back. My grandmother was waiting for me in the small adobe house where I grew up, in the Cuxtitali neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. I was much thinner and paler than the last time we saw each other, and the red spots now covered much of my arms and neck. She hugged me in silence, and in that embrace, I felt something I hadn't felt for a long time. Security. Belonging. "Tomorrow is Friday," she said, as she served me an herbal tea she had prepared. "The perfect day to renew the pact. But first you need to purify yourself." That night my grandmother performed a cleansing ritual. She lit copal, the sacred Mayan incense, and passed the aromatic smoke over my body while reciting prayers in tzotzil. Afterward, she prepared a bath with medicinal herbs collected from the mountains, rue, basil, rosemary, and others I didn't recognize. The water was hot and had a strong smell, but not unpleasant. As I bathed, I felt as if something was being washed away from me. Not just physical dirt, but something deeper, a spiritual impurity. After the bath, dressed in a traditional embroidered white tunic that my grandmother had kept for me, I lay down on the simple bed in my old room. I was exhausted, but at the same time I felt a strange peace. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid to sleep, to face the recurring dream. In fact, part of me wanted to see the deer again, to speak with it, to ask for forgiveness. The dream came, but it was different this time. I was still in the same misty forest, but there was no oppressive silence. I could hear the night sounds, of the jungle, the chirping of crickets, the distant hooting of an owl, the whisper of the wind in the leaves. I walked to the clearing, but instead of the wounded deer, I found the animal standing, healthy, its red fur shining under the moonlight. It observed me with those large, intelligent eyes, but there was no accusation in them now, only a kind of expectation. "You have returned," said the deer, its voice as clear as in the first dream, but now softer, less accusatory. "You have heard my call." "Yes," I replied, feeling a strange calm despite the surreal situation. "I have come to ask for forgiveness. I didn't understand the meaning of the tradition." The deer approached a few steps, its hooves barely making a sound on the leaf-covered ground. "It's not just about eating or not eating meat," it explained. "It's about honoring the connection between your people and the earth. When your ancestors were starving, I offered my body as food. In exchange, I only asked that they respect the day when the earth renews itself. By breaking that promise, you not only disrespected me, but all your ancestors who maintained that sacred agreement." I felt tears running down my face. "How can I fix this? How can I renew the promise?" The deer tilted its head, its eyes fixed on mine. "Tomorrow at dawn you must go to the sacred mountain. Bring an offering not of blood, but of something that represents your commitment to the earth. There you will renew the promise that your ancestors made, and then, perhaps, the balance can be restored." I woke up with the first rays of sunlight coming through the window. Unlike the other mornings of the past few weeks, I didn't feel the usual headache. My body was still weak, and the red spots still covered my skin, but there was a lightness in me that I hadn't felt for a long time. I told my grandmother about the dream while we were having coffee. "The sacred mountain is Witchcraft," she said, pointing through the window toward a mist-covered peak that rose to the west of the city. "It's a special place, where our ancestors always made their prayers. As for the offering," she thought for a moment, "it must be something personal, something that represents your commitment to our traditions." I thought about what I could offer. I didn't own many things of material value, especially here in San Cristobal, far from my life in Mexico City. Then I remembered the wedding band I still wore on my finger. It was a simple gold ring that Rodrigo had placed on my finger 3 years ago. It symbolized my modern life, my choice to move away from my family's traditions. It would be an appropriate sacrifice. My grandmother agreed with the choice but insisted that I shouldn't go alone. "You're weak, and the path to the mountain is steep and difficult." She called Don Miguel, an old healer who had known my family for decades. He arrived shortly after, a thin, wrinkled man wearing traditional clothes, white pants, an embroidered tunic and a straw hat. His eyes were dark and penetrating, and when he greeted me I felt as if he could see through me into my soul. We began our journey before dawn. The air was cold and humid, typical of Chiapas mornings, and fog covered the cobblestone streets of the ancient city. We walked in silence, first through the peripheral neighborhoods, then along increasingly steep paths that climbed the mountain. Don Miguel led the way, moving with surprising agility for his age. My grandmother came right behind, and I followed, fighting against the fatigue that still weighed in my bones. As we climbed, the vegetation changed, from houses with their colorful gardens to cultivated fields, and finally to the dense pine and oak forest that covered the top of the mountain. The sun was beginning to rise when we reached a small clearing. In the center, There was a formation of stones that looked like a natural altar. Don Miguel signaled for us to stop. "This is the place," he said, "where your great-great-grandfather made the original promise with the spirit of the deer." Don Miguel began to prepare the space for the ritual. He lit incense in a small clay brazier, and the aromatic smoke rose in spirals in the morning air. He scattered flowers and herbs around the stone altar, murmuring prayers in a low voice. My grandmother instructed me to kneel before the altar, while she and Don Miguel positioned themselves on each side. The ritual began with Don Miguel playing a small drum, its slow and hypnotic rhythm resonating through the silent forest. My grandmother began to sing an ancient melody that seemed to come from the stones and trees themselves that surrounded us. I felt a strange energy running through my body, as if the earth beneath my knees was pulsing, alive. Then came the moment for my offering. I took the ring off my finger, feeling the weight of the gold in my palm. I thought of Rodrigo, of our life together, of the future we had planned. For a moment, I hesitated. But then, I remembered the deer in my dream, the accusing eyes that now offered forgiveness. I placed the ring on the stone altar. "With this offering," I said aloud, repeating the words that Don Miguel instructed me to say, "I renew the promise made by my ancestors. I promise to honor the earth and its creatures, to respect the sacred days, and never again to eat meat on Fridays. This is my promise, made of my own free will, to restore the balance that was broken." As soon as I finished speaking, something extraordinary happened. A ray of sunlight broke through the trees, directly illuminating the altar where my wedding band rested. At the same moment, a deer appeared at the edge of the clearing, not in a dream this time, but real, its red fur shining under the rising sun. It remained there for just a moment, watching us with those large, intelligent eyes, before silently disappearing among the trees. Don Miguel and my grandmother didn't seem surprised. For them, it was just confirmation that the spirit had accepted my offering, my request for forgiveness. We completed the ritual with more prayers and songs, and when we finally stood up to return, I noticed something strange. The red spots on my arms seemed lighter, less inflamed. The pain that had been my constant companion in recent weeks had diminished considerably. In the days that followed, my recovery was almost miraculous. The spots on my skin disappeared completely, the headaches ceased, and my appetite returned, strongly. My grandmother prepared traditional dishes, tamales, homemade soups, handmade tortillas, and I ate with a pleasure I had forgotten. Little by little, I regained the lost weight and color returned to my face. More importantly, the nightmares with the wounded deer did not return. When I dreamed of the forest now, it was a peaceful, welcoming place, no longer threatening. Today, our life has returned to normal, but with some important changes. On Fridays, I prepare dishes without red meat, a tradition that Rodrigo now respects, even though he doesn't fully share the belief. Sometimes when I look out the window of our apartment in the big city, I have the impression of seeing a deer watching from afar, but perhaps it's just my imagination. What happened taught me that some traditions go beyond simple superstitions. They carry the wisdom of our ancestors, connect us with the earth and with something greater than ourselves. I learned that balance is fragile and that our choices, however small they may seem, can have profound consequences. Now I carry this lesson with me, honoring my roots while building my future. I was never much of a believer in superstitions or those divine punishment things, you know. My grandmother was always super religious and full of rules about what we could or couldn't do during religious festival periods in our city. I grew up hearing her say that eating red meat during the festival of Saint Cecilia would bring misfortune, that the spirits of the ancestors would become irritated and come to torment us. I always rolled my eyes when she started with those stories. I was 23 years old, college-educated, had a job, and believed I was old enough to decide what to believe. But after what happened that night, I don't know what to think anymore. I still tremble just remembering it, and it's been 3 months already. I'm writing this because I need to get it off my chest. I need someone to tell me I'm not going crazy, that there's a rational explanation for everything that happened. The festival began on a Friday. The entire city was decorated with those colorful little flags, people dressed in white, and the churches remained open day and night. My grandmother was especially strict that year. "Child, you know this is the year of the renewal cycle. It's the most important of all," she repeated while preparing that bland food we always made during the festival. Rice, beans, cooked vegetables, and no red meat. According to her, meat carried the energy of the dead and opened portals during the festival. I was tired after a stressful week at work and just wanted to relax. My friends invited me to a barbecue that night, and I simply couldn't resist. I thought, what harm could it do? It's just a silly superstition of old people. I snuck out after my grandmother went to sleep. She had been living with me since my parents died in a car accident 5 years ago. Our house was old, one of those with wooden floors that creak with every step. I had to tiptoe to avoid waking her. I remember looking toward her room before leaving and seeing the candles she always lit during the festival, creating strange shadows on the walls. For a second I felt a chill as if someone was watching me, but I ignored it. I locked the door and went to meet my friends in Carlos's backyard, a few blocks away. The barbecue was lively, with music, beer, and lots of meat. I ate a piece of juicy picanha and then another and another. It was delicious, and I savored each bite as an act of rebellion against my grandmother's beliefs. My friends didn't quite understand why I was so enthusiastic about a simple barbecue, but I didn't care. It was almost 2 in the morning when I decided to head home. Carlos offered to walk me, but I told him it wasn't necessary, that it was close and I knew the way well. That was the first of many decisions that night that I bitterly regret having made. The streets were deserted and strangely silent. Normally, even in the early morning, you could hear a dog barking or the noise of cars passing on the main avenue. But that night, nothing. The silence was so dense that I could hear my own breathing and the sound of my footsteps on the asphalt. The streetlights seemed weaker than normal, creating zones of darkness between one and another. I started walking, faster, feeling that uncomfortable sensation that someone was following me. I looked back every few meters, but saw no one. "It's just your imagination," I told myself. "You're being influenced by Grandma's stories." When I finally arrived home, I noticed something strange. There was an orange light coming from inside, flickering in the windows. My first thought was that my grandmother had discovered I'd gone out and was waiting up for me, but it didn't look like the light from a lamp or bulbs. It was more like fire. My heart raced when I realized what was happening. I ran to the door and opened it with trembling hands. The smell of smoke hit me immediately, making my eyes burn. "Grandma, Grandma, where are you?" I shouted, entering the living room. The fire had started at the altar my grandmother kept in the living room, where the photos of my parents and other deceased relatives were. The candles she always lit during the festival had somehow fallen and set the curtains on fire. The flames weren't large yet, but smoke was already invading the environment. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a bucket, filled it with water, and returned to put out the fire. I threw the water on the burning curtains and managed to control the fire before it spread. My heart was beating so hard, it felt like it was going to jump out of my mouth. It was then that I realized my grandmother hadn't responded to my shouts. "Grandma," I called again, walking toward her room. I opened the bedroom door slowly, fearing what I might find. To my relief, my grandmother was sleeping peacefully in bed, as if nothing had happened. How did she not wake up from the smoke and my shouts? I approached to check if she was okay, and that's when I noticed her skin was cold, very cold. "Grandma, wake up," I whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. She didn't move. I turned on the lamplight and saw her pale face, her lips slightly bluish. Panic overtook me when I realized she wasn't breathing. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and called emergency services. While waiting, I tried to perform CPR as I had learned in a university course, but something told me it was too late. Tears ran down my face as I pressed her chest, pleading, "Please, Grandma, don't leave." "Me, please." The ambulance arrived in less than 15 minutes, but it seemed like an eternity. The paramedics entered quickly, gently moving me aside as they took over the procedures. I stood in the corner of the room, hugging myself, watching as they tried to revive my grandmother. "No vital signs," I heard one of them say. "Apparently cardiac arrest during sleep." They continued trying for several minutes, but finally one of them looked at me with that expression I knew too well. The same expression the police officer had when he came to tell us about my parents' accident. I didn't need him to say anything. My grandmother was gone. I collapsed on the floor, sobbing as they covered her body. One of the paramedics approached, asking if I had someone who could keep me company at that moment. I shook my head. I was now completely alone. They took my grandmother's body and left me with some forms to fill out and instructions on what to do next. I sat in the living room, looking at the partially burned altar, the photos of my parents stained with soot. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixed with the smell of the herb candles my grandmother always lit during the festival. I couldn't stop thinking that if I hadn't gone out, if I hadn't eaten that damn meat, maybe I could have prevented the fire. Maybe I could have noticed my grandmother was feeling unwell. Guilt consumed me from within, like a corrosive acid. I picked up my phone to call anyone, but then I realized I didn't know who to call. My friends wouldn't understand. They considered my grandmother's beliefs silly, just as I had until a few hours ago. I decided to take a shower to try to calm down. The bathroom was at the end of the hallway, and I had to pass my grandmother's room to get there. The door was ajar, and I could see the empty bed with the sheet still wrinkled. I quickened my pace, avoiding looking inside. In the bathroom, I turned on the shower to the hottest temperature I could bear, as if the water could clean not only my body, but also the guilt and horror of that night. As the water ran over my body, I began to cry again, resting my forehead against the cold tiles. That's when I heard it. A whisper, so low that I almost thought it was just the noise of the water. But then it became clearer. "Why did you do this?" The voice was too familiar. I turned off the shower immediately, my heart racing. "Is anyone there?" I asked, quickly wrapping myself in a towel. Silence, just the sound of water droplets falling from the shower. I slowly opened the bathroom door and looked into the hallway. It was empty and dark. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, the stress of the situation making me hear things. I walked quickly to my room, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the floor. I put on the first clothes I found and sat on the bed, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to stay alone in that house, not after everything that had happened. I thought about going to a hotel, but something told me I should stay. It was as if I felt I owed it to my grandmother to stay and face the consequences of my actions. I returned to the living room and began to clean up the mess left by the small fire. I threw away the burned curtains and cleaned the soot from the walls and furniture. When I reached the altar, I hesitated. The photos of my parents were stained but still recognizable. I picked up the frame with their wedding photo and ran my fingers over the glass, cleaning off the layer of soot. That's when I noticed something strange. In the photo, my parents were smiling, as they always had been, but there was something different about their eyes. They seemed empty, as if someone had erased the life from them. I thought it was just an effect of the smoke or poor lighting, so I picked up another photo, this one of my father holding me as a baby. The same thing. His eyes were completely black, without shine, without life. A chill ran down my spine as I examined all the photos on the altar. In each one, the eyes of the deceased people were different, darkened, like bottomless wells. I dropped the photos, my hands trembling uncontrollably. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," I muttered to myself. "You're tired, traumatized." I decided I needed to rest a bit, try to sleep for a few hours before dealing with all the arrangements for my grandmother's funeral. I returned to my room, leaving all the lights on along the way. I couldn't face the darkness, not that night. I lay down on the bed without taking off my clothes, pulling the blanket up to my chin despite the heat of the summer night. I closed my eyes, but every time I did, I saw my grandmother's pale face, her bluish lips, and then the photos with those disturbing eyes. I opened my eyes again, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house was oppressive, interrupted only by the occasional creaking of the old wood and by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I tried to focus on that rhythmic sound, hoping it would help me fall asleep. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Fast till I realized that the sound was changing, becoming slower. Tick-tock, tick-tocks, and then it stopped completely. I looked at the clock. The hands were stopped exactly at midnight, which was impossible because it was already past 4 in the morning. I sat up in bed, suddenly alert. That's when I noticed it wasn't just the clock that had stopped. All sound had disappeared. The constant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant noise of cars on the avenue, even the sound of my own breathing seemed to have been swallowed by an unnatural silence. And then, in the midst of that absolute silence, I heard footsteps, slow dragging coming from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of the cloth slippers my grandmother always wore, sliding across the wooden floor. Tap, tap, tap. Approaching my room, I was paralyzed in bed, unable to move. As the footsteps came closer and closer, my breath was caught in my throat, and I could feel my heart beating so hard it seemed like it was going to explode. The footsteps stopped right in front of my door. There was a moment of absolute silence, and then the doorknob began to turn slowly. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The door opened with a long, sharp creak, revealing only the darkness of the hallway. There was no one there, at least no one I could see, but I could feel a presence, something watching from the shadows, something that carried a cold so intense. It made the temperature of the room drop drastically. My breath formed small clouds of condensation in the air. "Who's there?" I finally managed to ask, my voice trembling as much as my body. No answer, just that feeling of being watched. Then, slowly something began to enter the room. It wasn't a person, not even a defined shape. It was as if darkness itself was moving, sliding across the floor like a dense black fog. I backed up on the bed until my back hit the wall. The darkness continued advancing until it stopped at the foot of my bed. That's when I began to distinguish a shape within that dark mass. It was a face, or something that resembled a face. Deeply black eyes, the same eyes I had seen in the photographs, stared at me without blinking. I recognized that face, even distorted and shadowed. It was my father. "Dad," I whispered, not believing what I was seeing. The face contorted into an expression that was neither anger nor sadness, but something much more disturbing. It was as if he was suffering, trapped in some kind of eternal torment. His lips moved, but the sound that came out wasn't human. It was a low, guttural moan, as if it came from the depths of the earth. "You broke the pact," said a voice that wasn't my father's, but seemed to be composed of several voices speaking at the same time. "You opened the portal." The dark form began to expand, filling more and more of the room, while other faces began to appear within it. My mother, my paternal grandparents, uncles and aunts who had already passed on, all with the same empty eyes and tortured expressions. I jumped out of bed and ran toward the door, but it slammed shut violently before I could reach it. I pounded with my fists, screaming for help, but I knew there was no one who could hear me. The nearest house was almost 100 meters away, and even if someone heard, who would believe it? Who would come in the middle of the night to check on screams in a house where a young woman lived who had just lost her grandmother? I turned my back to the door, facing the darkness that now occupied almost the entire room. The faces approached, floating in the black mist, their mouths opening in silent screams. I closed my eyes tightly, telling myself that it wasn't real, that it was just a hallucination caused by trauma and exhaustion. When I opened my eyes again, they were still there, even closer. I could feel their cold breath against my face, a smell of damp earth and decomposition. "What do you want from me?" I asked, with tears running down my face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't believe." My father's face came closer, until it was inches from mine. His black eyes seemed to absorb all the light and heat around. "Blood calls to blood," said the horrible voice. "Flesh calls to flesh. You fed on the dead during the festival, now the dead will feed on you." I felt cold, damp hands touching my arms, my face, my neck. They weren't solid hands, but they seemed to have enough weight and substance to hold me against the door. I closed my eyes again and began to pray. I'm not religious, never was, but at that moment the prayers my grandmother had taught me when I was a child came to my mind. "Hail Mary, our Father," All the words I thought I had forgotten. I recited them aloud, my voice gaining strength as I continued. The hands on my body seemed to hesitate, the grip loosening slightly. I opened my eyes and saw that the forms were retreating, the darkness diminishing. I continued praying louder, more desperately. The voices began to scream, a sharp, painful sound that seemed to tear my eardrums, but I didn't stop. I remembered something my grandmother used to say: "The dead have power only if you give them that power. Faith is your protection." I managed to move away from the door and walk toward the darkness, still praying. The black mist retreated further, the faces contorting into expressions of fury and pain. I continued advancing until I reached the window. With a quick movement, I opened the curtains, letting in the weak light of dawn that was beginning to emerge on the horizon. The darkness hissed like water in a hot pan and began to dissipate rapidly. The faces were the last to disappear, their black eyes fixed on me until the last moment. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it all ended. I was left alone in the room, trembling, soaked in cold sweat, as the first rays of sun came through the window. I spent the rest of the day in a state of shock, moving around the house like a zombie, trying to convince myself that it had been just a terribly vivid nightmare. But I knew deep down that it hadn't been a dream. The marks of cold fingers on my arms, visible as dark spots on my skin, were too real. The smell of earth and decomposition that still hung in the air was too real. I called a friend and asked her to stay with me, making up an excuse about not wanting to be alone after my grandmother's death. She came and stayed for a few days, sleeping in the guest room. I didn't tell her what had happened. How could I? She would think I was crazy, and maybe I was.